Welcome and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, in this discussion series on democratic resilience in Europe. IFES assists electoral processes broadly defined across the world, and we have supported elections in European countries since the fall of Iron Curtain. This is the 25th installment in our series, and we have focused on issues ranging from election administration to inclusion, cybersecurity, disinformation targeting women in politics, abuse of state resources, and the role of Russia in European elections. If you have missed any of our previous discussions, recordings are available on our YouTube channel, and my colleague is putting a link in the chat now. I'm Nicoleta Dioshi, IFES Senior Program Officer at IFES Regional Europe Office in Prague, which is hosting this discussion. This event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic processes and is made possible by the generous support of American people. On February 24th last year, we were scheduled to hold a discussion in this series entitled "Defending Democracy in Ukraine equals defending democracy everywhere." That morning saw the start of the unprovoked and unjustifiable act of aggression by the Russian Federation, and we postponed the discussion to the following month. 1 year later, this issue is more important than ever. As I just mentioned, tomorrow will be 1 year from Russia's criminal full-scale invasion on Ukraine territory. Ukraine continues to demonstrate remarkable courage and resilience in defense of not only its physical borders, but also its democratic values. Ukraine has made significant democratic progress since its 2014 Revolution of Dignity. Maintaining this trajectory through war and peace will be fundamental to the nation's Euro-Atlantic ambitions. During today's discussion, our participants will hear about the needs and priorities that will be key to ensuring that after winning war, Ukraine also wins the peace. So with us today, we have Mr. Oleg Didenko, Chairperson of the Central Election Commission of Ukraine, Mr. Alexander Novikov, Head of National Agency on Corruption Prevention of Ukraine, Olga Aivazovska, Chairwoman of the Civil Network Opora from Ukraine, and Peter Urban, Principal Advisor, IFES Global and Senior Country Director in IFES Ukraine. After our discussion, we will open the floor for questions to our panelists. Should you already have a question or comment, you can already type those in using the Q&A function. So during the first round of questions, our panelists will talk about their institution's response to the invasion. So my first question would go to Mr. Oleg Didenko, Chairperson of the Central Election Commission of Ukraine, and also to Alexander Novikov, Head of National Agency on Corruption Prevention of Ukraine. As leaders of critical government bodies that are responsible for democratic elections and anti-corruption, what were some of the challenges you faced in the early days of the invasion, and what steps did you take to overcome them? So, Mr. Didenko, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good day. Thank you for having organized this truly important discussion. And just coming to your question, on the 24th of February, 2022, we all appeared in a new reality. In spite of everything, we were not ready for it. On the one hand, basically, there was a threat to life, to citizens' lives and the lives of our staff members when we heard the missile and rocket attacks. The information attack was also performed, and a lot of fake news were circulating around Telegram channels that soon the enemy will invade us. So people were driven by fear and the instincts of self-preservation. On the other hand, as the state authority, we had to continue performing our functions, and in spite of all subjective and objective obstacles and circumstances, most people appeared at work. We had conducted the meeting, extraordinary meeting, to adopt a very important resolution, and that the most important resolutions were to suspend the electoral processes and the referenda that were taking place at the time, because during the wartime, during martial law, elections cannot be held. Either elections or referendum. And in addition to it, we made a decision to terminate the activity of the state voter register. We did so in order to protect the data, the personal information of the voters, to prevent the aggressor, the possibility for the aggressor of getting control over the database. And in addition to it, to protect personal information of the citizens, of the voters who immediately appeared in the territories under occupation, not to create a threat to their lives. In addition to it, questions appeared for the Secretariat, how the Secretariat of the Central Election Commission should continue their operations, on the one hand, to preserve the life and health of our staff members, on the other hand, to preserve the documents, the databases, and nobody actually knew how the events would be unfolding, whether Kiev will be taken over. A lot of information was circulating in the media about the possible threat of taking over Kiev. So we had to make a decision about whether to evacuate or not to evacuate our staff members and our documents and their important assets, to find the best solution out of this situation. So our response was to introduce remote work during the first days of the war, and that is briefly about it within the framework of the time frame that we have to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Oleg Didenko. And now I turn to Alexander Novikov. So Alexander, the same question for you. What were some of the challenges you faced in the early days of the invasion, and what steps did you take to overcome them?
Slava Ukraine for everyone, and I want to come back a day before.
Glory to Ukraine.
23rd February, our team made a practical exercise of the methodology of team of teams that was created by the head of the United Headquarters of U.S. Army in Iraq, General McChrystal. We use this methodology to coordinate our teams during before the war and during the war, and it gives us resilience during the first day and first weeks and first year of the war. Of course, the main challenge was to guarantee the connections and guarantee the in each team of our big team of teams. We use Slack Messenger for these connections because it's more secure than and more for joint work than other messages or communications. A core of our team work from the morning in our office, and we destroyed all of our secret documents. We close, as Oleg team, our registers to protect public officials data from our enemies. We gave clarifications of submission declaration process, and from the first day of the war, the NCP team quickly adopted to the conditions of martial law and redistributed resources, taking into account new challenges and threats. Many of our employees defend Ukraine as a part of armed forces, and we are doing our best to speed up the victory. That is why the NCP, as the largest analytical body, started separate projects during the war, in particular the siege for persons, and it was a request of our MFA for persons and companies involved in the war from them for the imposed sanctions, to the siege for foreigners and Russian companies, and we are doing this work until this day. And the beginning of a school scale invention, mandatory electronic declaration was suspended, and the public part of the register, as I previously mentioned, was closed due to the safety of public servants. Therefore, the currently part of the NCP powers of NCP are suspended. However, we continue to work on the prevention of corruption, and we conduct in first months and now anti-corruption expertise of draft laws and government resolutions, monitor the lifestyle of officials now. But in the first 2 months of the war, we created a special register of collaborants who from public officials who have worked with enemies, and we gave this data to Secret Service of Ukraine. It was our main challenges on the first days of the war, and of course we guarantee the safety of our staff. We created an office, a temporary office in Chernivtsi, and biggest part of our staff have worked until August in Chernivtsi. So the safety is first.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Thank you. My next question would be to Olga Ivazovska, but unfortunately she is experiencing some technical difficulties, so hopefully she will be able to join us a little bit later. So I will move to Peter Urban, Principal Advisor, IFES Global and Senior Country Director in IFES Ukraine. Peter, IFES works on critical issues around democracy and good governance worldwide. However, democracy is under attack worldwide. In Ukraine, this took on a literal connotation. What does Ukraine's struggle mean for the global struggle for democracy? Why should the world care?
First, let me thank you for organizing this event and for giving me this opportunity to participate. I also want to thank my dear friends for joining us today, and for them to speak with Ukrainian voices from Ukraine. Now, I think it's extremely important to remember that this is our war. It's a war that belongs to all of us. Unfortunately, fought by Ukraine, with us more in a supporting role. But it's so important to see that this war has reminded populations around the world of who we should be, of the value of freedom, of the value of living in democracy. So I would say the world cares, and it certainly must care. This war is a binary struggle. There's no grayscale. It's autocracy pitted against democracy. Autocracy cannot win, as this will further drag societies towards inhuman, undemocratic behaviors. And as we have seen in the last decade, we've seen a decline in democracy worldwide. This has to turn. And I think a Ukrainian victory, which will happen, gives an opportunity for this. So there is no doubt that Ukraine must win this war and play an historic part in saving democracy as the best form of governance for societies worldwide. Ukraine must also win the peace once the war is over. And this means further strengthening of Ukraine's democracy and its electoral processes. That is what Ukrainian soldiers have suffered and fought for every single day of this war. So there's a great challenge in front of Ukraine to be the beacon that it can be for societies worldwide. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So in the first round, we touched on the challenges you faced at the beginning of the war, and now we will speak about how you feel you did during these difficult times and also what you achieved. So my first question goes to Alexander Novikov. Alexander, as emphasized by the recent SEPA article, quote, Ukrainians aren't dying for a corrupt future, unquote. What does this mean to you, and how can Ukraine balance fighting a war on one hand while fighting corruption on the other?
We and NCP believes that building an integrity is a key for our victory, because this war is not only a war for the protection of Ukrainian territories, but also a war for the protection of democratic values and the civilizational choice of Ukraine. And our path is to democratic and integrity vote. Unfortunately, many Ukrainians gave their lives for the freedom, independence, and opportunity to change the state. And this happened not only after a full-scale invasion, February 24, but since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And all anti-corruption infrastructure was created as an answer on this request of Ukrainian society about dignity, freedom, and democracy. We recently commemorated the heroes of the Heavenly Hundreds 2 days ago. They were among the first to die for the values of freedom and possibility of Ukraine being a part of the European Union. The demand for justice and new social contract today is higher than ever, because the price of losses is colossal for Ukraine. And we simply do not have the right to fail and lose the chance for radical changes in society. Therefore, a corrupt future in Ukraine simply has no right to exist. And I want to mention that, highlight that corruption is not in Ukrainian DNA. It's a result of our mutual history with Russia. Corruption is in DNA in Russian autocratic system. Anti-corruption bodies, civil society, and journalists are making a lot of efforts to prevent from happening the returning of corruptional practices during the war and after the war. In December of the last year, a survey was conducted on the public mood of the population. Where is the most important thing for the citizens after the victory? According to Ukrainians, the fight against corruption is one of the top 3 post-war priorities for the state. In the first place, 41% is the restoration of infrastructure. The second, with 36%, is overcoming corruption, and 21 as strengthening defense capabilities. So the strengthening of defense capabilities is lower in the minds of the citizens than overcoming corruption. What Ukrainians could tolerate before the war is becoming absolutely intolerable now. According to the results of surveys in 2021, the number of citizens who already are ready to protest against corruption reached more than 80%, which is twice as much as in 2021, twice higher than a year ago in wartime. So resident corruption cases are an exception. More public servants are honest. The surveys show us it. This confirms that submission of declarations and other anti-corruption measures have to be restored here in Ukraine. NACP, NABU, SAPO, High Anti-Corruption Code work together to reduce the level of corruption during wartime. And there is still a lot of work ahead to consolidate this progress, and corruption was the exception. not the habit of Ukrainians in war and post-war times.
Thank you so much, Alexander. My next question goes to Oleg Didenko. Oleg, last year was a clear challenge also for the Central Election Commission. With no possibility of scheduling elections during martial law, the CEC went on and developed proposals to the election legislation, organized discussions on the topic of post-war related electoral challenges, updated its strategic plan, continue learning from the international experience, and so much more. How does war impact Ukrainian elections, and what is the role of election commission in the time of war?
Thank you for your question. Indeed, it was a challenging year for Ukraine in general and for the CEC in particular. The impact of the martial law and the war over elections is great. Ultimately, no elections can be conducted in the wartime. On the other hand, we understand that the more time the war is ongoing and the more destruction we are going to have, the more difficult it will be for us to organize post-war elections. In addition to organizational challenges, additional complexity will be coming from elevated expectations from the society and the demand from the society for the way elections are conducted. Therefore, it will be extremely challenging to conduct the first post-war elections to ensure Ukraine and the electoral administration meets all the challenges and all the expectations to ensure further democratic transformations. In addition to it, I would like to say that the CEC is fulfilling a number of ordinary functions, such as the replacement of members of parliament who were dismissed from the list of MPs, and making sure the MPs that no longer work in the parliament get replaced. We worked on updating our strategic plan. Besides, we fulfilled a number of functions that were conditioned by the wartime. For example, opposing fake news about the fake referenda. We thought about how to protect the life and health of election commission members residing in the occupied territories. We wanted to protect them ultimately, so we decided to terminate or suspend their powers, not to make them a victim for the enemy. New challenges are coming from the area of international cooperation. We at the CEC have actively contributed to efforts to counter the presence of Russian delegations and the Russian bodies inside of international organizations such as electoral management body, international associations. We want to make sure Russian delegations become isolated from the activities of such international associations. And of course, we perform the most important function is preparation for the post-war elections. Clearly, we understand that the post-war elections will be the most difficult. we have never had as difficult elections ever, and yet it is unclear when the elections might be held, and the CEC should take a leading role in that. Clearly, all central authorities, central government authorities should work on their respective scope of powers and respective areas of responsibilities. Indeed, our job is to prepare for the post-war elections, to make sure we are well prepared when time comes for that.
Thank you so much, Oleg. And my last question goes to Peter. Peter, where does democracy fit into the thematic 7 conditions set by the European Union for Ukraine's candidacy?
While elections are not explicitly mentioned in these 7 conditions, they are indeed deeply embedded in these. In fact, IFES was involved in discussions around what reforms should be called for by the European Union, and we were in agreement with the spread that we saw in the final paperwork. A few examples of this is that for electoral quality to further rise in Ukraine, corruption in all its forms must be fought, including the crucial area of money in politics. Political corruption and the use of so-called black money by politicians and political parties is a cancer in Ukrainian democracy and is holding back Ukraine from achieving its full democratic potential. A practical example of how this can be fought is that the reporting of political party on their finances must be restarted. There is no excuse for this currently being suspended. Another example is media reform, also within the 7 issues raised by the EU. This reform is pivotal to creating a more balanced and fair political contest where the public is well informed on the electoral choices that they face. Ukraine deserves a cleaner, more balanced, and more transparent political contest, and must absolutely demand that this media reform is realized. Electoral reform has actually been one of the top performing areas since 2014, which is one reason why it isn't directly included in the 7 points. For the Election Commission, Oleg with us today, for political parties and for the people of Ukraine, this should be recognized, even if there is still many things that need to be achieved, that can be achieved to further strengthen these elections. Also, we have to recognize that if we look at the 7 areas and compare it with electoral reform, for example, anti-corruption, judicial reform, and media reform still has a much longer way to go.
Thank you very much, Peter. So let's now slowly move away from the present time and head towards the post-war priorities. So my next question will be to Oleg Didenko. Last week, it was announced that the CEC has been participating in the implementation of the national strategy for the creation of a barrier-free space, which is extremely relevant with the rising number of veterans and civilians with disabilities. Can you tell us which proposals to this strategy the CEC has submitted and which of these were adopted?
Thank you for your question. Indeed, this question of protection of persons with disabilities in the elections, this question becomes especially relevant in connection with hostilities. Unfortunately, we have more and more people with disabilities as a result of hostilities. At the CEC, we have created the working group chaired by Serhiy Pastivy, the CEC member. And this working group has worked a lot engaging the civil society, the international partners, and in December of 2022, CEC and IFES Ukraine were recognized as the international award laureates to ensure for the efforts to ensure inclusive processes for voters with disabilities and for ensuring their active participation in the political life. So we continue our efforts, and back in December of 2022, we have submitted our proposals to the draft resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers, the government of Ukraine, to approve measures to implement the national strategy to create a barrier-free environment for the electoral processes as well as other processes. So part of our proposals were taken into account in the development of the national strategy for the creation of a barrier-free environment. In particular, such proposals as mandatory translation of the documents into the sign language and access to information materials for the voters at the polling stations. In particular, we have established a requirement for the electoral stakeholders to provide for accessible materials, inclusive materials for all groups of voters with mandatory translation into the sign language. All election campaign materials must be translated into the sign language. In addition to it, we suggested to add the provision to have smart adaptation for persons with disabilities at the polling site. And we have suggested to develop a special procedure for the smart adaptation and establish the methods of smart adaptation based on the type of disability. Not all proposals were actually included in the action plan, yet it is very important that we work to ensure that all conditions are in place for all groups of voters, including broadband internet connection, to make sure that the voters can use all the necessary instruments, in particular for the forthcoming elections, taking into account that the national strategy and the action plan have been developed for 2023-2024. Perhaps that is a lot to take and to work on, yet we believe that it is possible to consolidate efforts with other public authorities to solve all these questions and challenges. The relevance of this issue is more and more important, and the people with disabilities require more attention and focus from the side of the public authorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oleg Didenko. I will turn back to Peter. Peter, in your recent article for the Atlantic Council, you emphasized that Ukraine must not only win the war, but also win the peace. What does winning the peace mean for Ukraine? And how can the international community and friends of Ukraine support Ukraine winning the peace?
I think it's quite clear that Ukraine is suffering and fighting this war for its amazing people to live in freedom and democracy after the war. It's clear that peace must deliver on this promise and offer Ukrainians even better governance for the future. Alexander just stressed the fact that the old corrupt practices that have permeated Ukraine society in the past can no longer be accepted. And similarly, Ukrainians will and should demand that their democracy is strengthened and even better governance, service delivery becomes a reality. International friends do play a very important role in this. I mean, first and foremost, we need to realize that the Ukrainian state will not have the funds necessary to do all the reforms that we hope for the Ukrainian people to see. And therefore, we, the international friends, must not only support the war itself, we also need to strengthen our support for democratic reforms, as this is a foundation of a future better governance in Ukraine. We need to make sure that changes to legal frameworks and rebuilding of electoral infrastructures happen now, while the war is ongoing, in order for these to be ready for when peace comes. When peace comes in Ukraine, there will be a torrent of elections in the first years of peace. As we all know, the constitution is very clear, and we will have parliamentary elections, presidential elections, and local elections shortly after peace comes around. So it's up to us to make sure that these elections will be as well held as possible so that they do not disrupt the absolutely crucial rebuilding and recovery which the country needs. So therefore, it's immensely important that we make sure that the political processes and the electoral outcomes that will be a reality when peace comes around, that these will happen in a way that disrupts the rebuilding and the recovery as little as possible. That groundwork must be laid now, and international friends must support this. Let's also be honest about the fact that the international friends can play a very important role in reminding Ukrainian political elites on what aspirations that the world has, that Europe has, and I would argue the Ukrainian people has, of its political elites in terms of building a better society. So when we see things happen in Ukraine, for example, on new legislation that may not meet these aspirations, that international friends can, shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine's civil society and others, keep reminding political elites of the direction that we all hope that Ukraine will take in years after the war is won.
Thank you so much, Peter. And my last question for this round would go to Alexander Novikov. Alexander, there is a national anti-corruption strategy that was adopted last year by the parliament. And based on this strategy, National Agency on Corruption Prevention developed the anti-corruption program, which is now pending the approval by the government. Can you tell us what are the priority areas within this program?
An important achievement was the adoption of anti-corruption strategy until 2025 by Verkhovna Rada last June. We are thankful for Danish government for the pressure on our parliament in adoption of this strategy. And for its implementation, the NACP developed a draft state anti-corruption program for 2023-2025. This document will become a high-quality tool for the implementation of anti-corruption policy, the development of Ukraine as a European state, transparent post-war reconstruction, and the formation of a virtual society, the state of integrity. What does the program involve? There are more than 1,600 measures in 15 of the most important areas. Priority areas are increasing the effectiveness of the anti-corruption system, ensuring the inevitability of responsibility for corruption, prevention of corruption in areas such as defense, justice, the real sector of the economy, state regulation of economy, custom affairs and taxation, construction, land and infrastructure. This first is very important for reconstruction of Ukraine, healthcare, education and social protection. The State Anti-Corruption Program also envisaged the creation of the world's best tool for the transparency of political finances and its scaling for the possibility of electronic submission of reports of the receipts and use funds of all elections and referendums, which guarantees the integrity of the political system. We hope to make this project together with IFES and with CEC. We expect that the government will adopt the document next Tuesday. Why it is important why is it important that this be done as soon as possible? First, it will speed up the development of integrity, both in ethical component and the effectiveness of the work of all state bodies, including Ministry of Defense, as a key for our victory. And for all issues that we are discussing now for elections and so on. Secondly, it will promote reforms in the most problematic and corrupt areas. And what is important, it will help to save more than 100 billion annually. Billions annually. Third, it will ensure a transparent reconstruction process and promote European integration. For Ukraine, it's a key for democracy.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And finally, we'd like to discuss the steps to be taken to guarantee a free and democratic post-war Ukraine. So my next question will go to Oleg Didenko. What steps can Ukraine take now to ensure that post-war elections continue Ukraine's positive tradition of democratic elections since its revolution of dignity?
This is a very good question indeed, and we all have to find the right answers to this question, answers in plural, because there are many answers. To prepare in a quality way, we have to determine the main problems and challenges. If we talk about the future elections and democratic elections, we have to identify a number of problems. First of all, is security threats and challenges. I mean, external challenges as well as internal challenges, attempts to destabilize Ukraine from within, cyber threats and challenges. We have another major problem, such as a destroyed infrastructure, that will make it an extra challenging task to prepare for and conduct elections. Besides, we have millions of internally displaced persons, and we have to ensure their right to vote can be exercised in due conditions. Millions of Ukrainians have fled abroad. We have to make sure they have all the conditions in place to exercise their right to vote, to update the state voter register is another challenge. Indeed, we will be faced with much greater financial needs because there will be many challenges to cope with, which it would take a lot of resources compared with regular time, with peaceful time. We have to think about how we can conduct information campaigns, how convey the information across citizens, across voters, in particular voters who are temporarily residing abroad, and what kind of information attacks we might expect. Furthermore, in order to overcome these challenges, which I have already mentioned, and other challenges, we have to prepare ourselves in advance. We have to ensure quality quality work, quality cooperation across a number of public authorities, including the Parliament of Ukraine, because without due legal framework, we won't be able to succeed. We have to make sure we have quality legislation developed in advance. Many bodies are involved in it, in particular, as far as voting out of country is concerned. In particular, we might rely on cooperation with the foreign ministry to protect ourselves from cyber threats. We have to rely on cooperation with civil society, with political parties. Obviously, we will have to reconsider our role in the conduct of elections to make sure the elections are deprived of the conflict triggers, because many people in the post-war might be still very vulnerable and with a great number of weapons among the population. Conflict-prone situations are likely to appear. It is very important to study the international best practices, to rely on the best practices of other countries who have been through similar challenges. We have to continue looking for solutions, identifying problems, and getting ready to tackle all the challenges that the future will bring. We all understand that in spite of all the challenges, the post-war elections will be of paramount importance to decide the future development of Ukraine and the future prospects of Ukraine. Hopefully, by joining efforts with our international partners, we can be best prepared for that and will be able to overcome all the challenges.
Thank you so much, Oleg. As I mentioned before, we couldn't get Olga Aivazovska online due to her technical difficulties, but my colleague told me that we have her colleague here, Miss Olga Kotsiuruba, and I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly. She's a senior legal advisor, so I would just maybe like to ask a couple of questions to you, Olga. What would be the role of civil society after the war? What do you think?
Так, доброго дня, колеги. Перепрошую, що, власне, запізнилися, тому що пізно з'ясувалося.
Hello, dear colleagues. I'm sorry for technical difficulties. Miss Olga is right now in Nigeria observing elections. She is on the election observation mission in Nigeria, and she is experiencing some technical difficulties. We will continue our work, everything that we are already doing, and we, as Mr. Oleg has mentioned, we are closely working together with the CC, with the NACP, and basically we have a few projects to complete, and we have to make sure we complete them. And in spite of the martial law at wartime, we continue our efforts. Last Monday, we have had a roundtable together with the Line Parliamentary Committee on discussion of amendments to the legislation on campaigning. And in April, we plan to conduct an event dedicated to political finance reporting. We work together with the CC experts and the NACP experts on this question. We have the requirement of the e-reporting. We also have paper-based reports as far as local elections are concerned. If we talk about national elections, we have the legally established requirement of electronic reporting. So We have started work across a number of sectors, in spite of the fact that the work has been started in the end of 2021 to make amendments to the legislation. We continue our efforts. The work is still in progress. As Mr. Oleg has mentioned, we have to make sure the legislation is updated and all the necessary legal provisions have to be in place before the first post-war elections. I would like to mention security criteria, evaluation of possibility of holding elections in certain communities, even following the completion of hostilities. We understand that not all communities will find themselves in similar situations in terms of security. We understand that the draft law on security considerations has been developed based on the previous draft laws developed jointly with civil society. We believe that a comprehensive study will have to be conducted as far as security profile of communities is concerned. We have to develop the concept of security profile of the community. We have to pilot this concept and to work together with local communities to be able to complement the proposed amendments developed by the CEC to the electoral legislation. We could just add the data from the grassroots level. We have experts and professionals across the country who can provide such data input. We work together with international partners and experts. Recently, last week, we have published a survey. We have the data that we can obtain from public authorities. We have established that there is a discrepancy in the data provided by different state authorities. It is very difficult to establish authentic number of Ukrainian voters residing in each of the foreign countries. We want to work with Ukrainian diplomatic offices and consular sections to establish what kind of problems they anticipate during the first post-war elections, so that during the draft bill consideration in the parliament, we can complement our proposed amendments with actual data and field study input. And in fact, this is the role of civil society to provide this expert support and evaluation in developing the legal framework. And of course, we can conduct our efforts due to support of IFES. We conduct the study due to support of IFES. If elections are held abroad, out-of-country voting is organized abroad, how can we make sure that vote buying does not take place? And how can we ensure proper campaigning and proper environment for campaigning, especially taking into account that the legislation of Ukraine is different than the legislation of the host country that hosts Ukrainian refugees, and how to make sure administrative offenses get investigated. So we continue our efforts in spite of the wartime, and with the ultimate goal being our victory. We understand that we cannot postpone everything until after the victory. So we are trying to do our best as civil society organization, to do everything we can right now. But we understand that without this synergy, without cooperation, now there is no good time for competition between social society groups or contestation, hostile contestation. Of course, we welcome contestation of ideas, and suggestions, and we, as civil society organization, are always open to it. We are looking forward to more collaboration opportunities with other civil society groups, and we would be happy to contribute to joint efforts and projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Olga. We actually received a lot of questions about out-of-country voting, so I will get back to it. But my next question is to Alexander Novikov. Alexander, what are the most important steps that Ukraine needs to advance in the area of anti-corruption over the next 2 years in the context of European integration and in general?
I want to give a context for answer for this question. First of all, the war is a result of corruption. The war is a result of degradation of Russian Federation from modern state into medieval tyranny. And in reality, we have, as a former part of Russia, have the same problems, still have the same problems. For example, the parliament have blocked anti-corruption strategy for 3 years. The parliament is now blocking the political party reports for more than 3 years. Almost for 1 year, the parliament is blocking the restoration of submission of declarations. The government is blocking the adoption of state anti-corruption program. The government of Ukraine, not the government of Russia, is blocking the adoption of state anti-corruption program of Ukraine. That is why our main priority is approval and implementation of state anti-corruption program for 3 years. Why? Because according to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, corruption is a threat for all societies and a threat for all democracies. So the implementation and adoption of this program is our priority. The second priority is the restoration of declarations during the war. Is a proof that Ukraine complies with international obligations and is on course for membership in the European Union. Resumption of submission and verification of reports of political parties is our third priority. And I want to highlight that despite the suspension of submission and verification of reports of political parties, we set an ambitious goal for ourselves and hope to achieve it together with IFES. To create the world's best political finance transparency tool and its scaling. This includes after filling of electoral fund reports, conducting automatic checks, all political finance on one platform. 100 digital transformation and introduction of new IT tools to reduce corruption is our fourth priority. Fifth is transparent post-war reconstruction, and we work a lot on this issue. And sixth is, and the most important thing, is the formation of integrity as a permanent, not situational practice, and zero tolerance for corruption. It's our priorities.
Thank you so much, Alexander. So I can see that we have 15 minutes for the questions and answers, so we can maybe start. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function and you can type the question in. And in the meantime, I will start reading already a couple of questions that came in. So maybe we can discuss the out-of-country voting as people were interested. So question for Oleg Didenko. How is it planned to organize the voting of Ukrainians who are abroad?
Дякую за запитання. Дійсно, дуже.
Thank you for your question. This is a very relevant question, and we are concerned about that. We understand that millions of Ukrainians were forced to flee Ukraine and go abroad. So we want to make sure we can provide them with possibilities to vote if they are still abroad as of the time of the post-war elections. There are several aspects to this question. First of all, out-of-country voting is traditionally a very challenging task because there are very few polling sites established for out-of-country voting. Polling sites are typically organized in embassies and the consular sections of Ukraine abroad. And typically, this issue is regulated by the electoral legislation. The Central Election Commission may develop some suggestions and recommendations, but the ultimate decision will have to be made by the Verkhovna Rada, Parliament of Ukraine, as far as the process of organizing the out-of-country voting is concerned. We can pay attention to 2 points. Number one, we have suggested to provide for legal grounds to expand the possibilities to establish polling sites abroad, outside of premises of diplomatic and consular offices of Ukraine. If this proposed amendment is adopted, it would require great efforts and joint efforts with the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine and the governments of other countries to ensure we can establish polling sites to ensure the possibility for Ukrainian voters to exercise their right to vote. In addition to it, to contribute to the discussion about extending the time period for voting to add not only Sunday as the day of voting, but Saturday, to expand this time span during which voters can vote. Of course, this has to be discussed and to involve different stakeholders in such discussions. Of course, we continue working on those issues. IFES in particular has presented us with a comprehensive study on out-of-country voting. At the Secretariat of the CC, we work on it, and we plan to create the working group to examine thoroughly the methodologies, how we can actually organize out-of-country voting, to identify strengths and weaknesses of use of different scenarios and different methodologies, so that the Parliament of Ukraine, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, when making a decision at that point, will be able to be well informed on this subject. Furthermore, we have to think about how we can optimize those processes. How can we increase the capacity, effective capacity of every polling station by using very simple tools to increase the capacity of how many voters one polling station can receive. And we would rely on the civil society and international partners in that work to find the best modalities of organizing out-of-country voting.
Thank you so much, Oleg. If any other of our panelists would like to add to this question, please feel free. Maybe Olga, please.
Так, може я додам, що теж
I would like to add that currently we discuss one of the very important topics, the electoral system, and to what extent the electoral system of open list can and should be used for out-of-country voting. This is a rather political aspect, and of course it is very correct approach that the CEC is taking, that the CEC is not involved in political aspect of this process to tackle this question as an administrative question. But we would like to contribute to the debate of the electoral system and the open list. Perhaps for out-of-country voting, it would make sense to allow voters the possibility to vote on political parties, not on individual candidates within the political party list. Yet, it is very important to ensure for voters inside the country to have the possibility and the right to vote based on electoral system with open lists. We can talk about increasing the number of inside. Of course, it would drive the cost significantly, but the research that was already mentioned talks about how to ensure security of voters and public order. All these questions have to be thoroughly examined before final decisions are made, starting from ballot paper transfer and delivery and with the question of security and custody, keeping of ballot papers in custody of election administration, who will be doing that, ensuring secure storage of ballot papers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga. We have another question for Alexander. What should be done to ensure that the young next generation of Ukrainians is intolerant to corruption? How can NACP help with that? And there is another question, and I apologize, just a second to re-click. How do you plan to embody the right behavior in people if you want to use the carrot and stick method with regards to corruption?
Very interesting question. We have an answer on it in our anti-corruption strategy. We have a lot of measures to build the culture of integrity from kindergarten, from schools, from universities, and for adults. We have a special components about integration, the standards of integrity in programs of all educational levels. And we have created the special online platform for learning the issues of integrity, studying another program, and we believe in building integrity more than in cultural integrity more than in punishment, more in stick. We believe in carrot. And why it is so? Because in open world, 10 years ago, the CEO of Google, Larry Schmidt, wrote a book, New Digital World. And in New Digital World, all information is open and transparent. So all your corruption activities will be open for society. And if you want to be a success in a long-term period, you have to be to be a part of culture of integrity. So the technologies demands from us to be integrity, and it's a main carrot for everyone.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And we have the last 4 minutes. So I will pose one last question, and it's open for everyone. What advice would you give yourself if you could go back in time 12 months? And anybody can, okay, Alexander.
I want to start.
Okay, go ahead.
We will do the same things, only faster. We think that we have to to move faster and to make more pressure for the parliament and for the government for implementation the culture of integrity. And we had a window of possibilities for first 3 months of the war to change a lot of things. Of course, we did a lot. For example, our agency created first law in continental Europe about the confiscation of assets of people who involved in this war, of people who are under the sanctions. It's a success of our team. But we did not implement. We have not implemented yet in our criminal code the responsibility for the sanction invasion. And in reality, in fact, we are now, NACP is now the government body which is responsible for sanctions. And we have two main tools for our victory: Ukrainian army and sanctions. So it's a key for victory to work faster and to make more pressure on the approaches that have the basis in our joint history with Russia on the corruptional approaches.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Any other panelists that would like to add?
Можемо тільки погодитися так з паном Олександром.
I can say that I agree with Alexander. We are trying to do our best to, and we continue. We have been always doing. But we have to do it faster or more. We have started a new area of activities such as documenting war crimes. Perhaps we should have studied it faster, learning from best practices and also practices of war elections. We belong to the group of organizations that work on issues of elections in communities adjacent to the areas of hostilities. For example, elections in 18 communities close to the contact line. I think we should have been more proactive in that.
Thank you very much, Olga. So we have the one last minute. Thank you so much. I would like to thank you to all our panelists for joining and not only reflecting on the last year, but also talking about the future and the future of democratic Ukraine. I would also like to thank our amazing interpreter, Irina, and to all our participants who joined today. On behalf of IFES, I would like to say that we stand with Ukraine. We support Ukraine, and because not only you fight for your country, but you also fight for our countries and the whole democratic world. Slava Ukraini!